Okay, I think you can start now.
Okay. So, welcome everyone. I think we can start today's CPGIS education webinar series, and today we are very honored to have our speaker, Dr. Xu Yang from Polytechnic University of Hong Kong, and today I think we have like we already have like 60% to join us, and I'm sure we will have more to join us. And first, I would like to give a very short introduction about Dr. Xu Yang. And Dr. Xu Yang is an assistant professor in the Department of Land Survey and Geoinformatics and Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and I'm also working in Hong Kong for like 6 years, so which is very famous in China, and also very famous in the world about the geoinformatics, and Dr. Xu has a lot of Dr. Xu chair the program of Master of Science in Urban Informatics and the Smart City, and he also was the board member of our CPGIS, and Dr. Xu has published a lot of papers, and I remember some papers has been published in AAG, so which are very famous like papers, and also AAG is also a very famous journal in our geography, and Dr. Xu has also won a lot of awards like some paper awards and from IFITT, and which is also a very important award from the world. And also I think Dr. Xu's research is very important because, as we know, we have like physical geography, and also we have like human geography. How to link these two parts together, and it's very important for us. So Dr. Xu give some like research and just try to like today's topic, understanding human mobility in a dynamic and changing world. So which is like to link our human behavior and also like the physical world. So which is very important, and I think which is very interesting, and also like this is also like the cutting edge area in our geography. So let's welcome Professor Xu Yang to give this topic. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for the nice introduction of Professor Chen, and I also want to thank our CPGIS President Professor Gao and Dr. Wu Qiushen. So they have done a lot in preparing this event. I really appreciate to have this opportunity to exchange the research ideas. So the presentation title is Understanding Human Mobility in a Dynamic and Changing World. I come up with this title for two reasons. First, I think human mobility as a field is rapidly evolving because of the emergence of new technologies and data sets. The ways we can measure and understand human mobility are becoming very diverse these days. And at the meantime, the world is facing many challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and public health crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, the field is expected to maintain its very dynamic nature in the future. There will be new research focus and questions. So today I want to take this opportunity to share some of the research that we have been doing over the years regarding human mobility analysis on two fundamental population groups in cities, which are residents and visitors. Human mobility is an interdisciplinary field, so the general objective is to understand and model how individuals move in time and space. It's also a fundamental research topic in many disciplines, such as geography, GIS science, and also transportation science, physics and complexity science, and also urban science. There are many important papers that talk about the conceptualization of human mobility, the roles of emerging data sets, and also the models to advanced mobility mining and modeling. From a geography or geospatial perspective, there are three critical dimensions of human mobility. I think most of us are very familiar with that, which are space, time, and semantics. So when we talk about each of these dimensions, we will think of many concepts under the big umbrella of human mobility. For instance, talking about space, we would think of travel distance, activity location, spatial scale of movements, spatial interaction patterns. In terms of time, we would think of temporal variation, seasonality, time use, things like this. And in terms of semantics, we would think of type of activity, mode of transportation, travel purpose, etc. When we link two dimensions together, there will be additional concepts. For instance, when you link space-time, you think about travel frequency, trip chain. These are more from transportation perspective, and we have mobility motive, more from complexity and network science perspective. When you link space and semantics, you think of place, urban function, land use. And also there are broader concepts in geography, such as human activity space, human dynamics that would link all these three dimensions together. So our research has been tackled part of some of these concepts, depending on the research context and application purpose. And in terms of because the theme of this CPGIS series about geospatial big data, so I want to talk a little bit about the impact of geospatial big data on mobility research. So these new data sets, such as mobile phone data, smart card transactions, geotag, social media, they do have their advantages. Usually they have broader spatial population coverage, collected in near real time, a variety type of data. So these are the advantages, which also correspond to the three big V's of big data: volume, velocity, and variety. But downside, these data come up with limitations, such as some data have issues of positional or say location uncertainty, and sometimes the data is sparse in space and also in time. For example, if you think about geotag social media, less than 1% of the geotag tweets are geotag. And also some of these data, like core detail records, a typical type of mobile phone data, they are not produced initially for performing scientific research. Therefore, charging people for billing purpose, charging how much people have used their phone. So in other words, the semantic information might be very limited in these data sets. So our research has been trying to take advantage of these three big V's, but also trying to partially address or mitigating these issues. So today's talk is going to be divided into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce some of our research that use mobile big data to understand mobility of urban residents and their linkage with socioeconomic environment and impact on human interactions and segregation. And the second part will switch its focus to introduce how geospatial technologies and big data are used to understand tourist mobility patterns. And at the very last part, if I still have time, I want to introduce a few cases, pilot studies that look into mobility in post-pandemic cities. So when people use their phones, smartphones, they leave digital footprints. So that's why mobile phone data have become a powerful data source for understanding people's use of urban space. As some of you know, a very interesting or fundamental question in geography and urban science is how people's use of urban space is related to the underlying social economic environment. So in this study, we try to tackle this question somehow. So we choose Shenzhen as a study case, and we are analyzing a large-scale core detail records, CDR datasets in Shenzhen. So CDR is a typical type of mobile phone data. So whenever people make phone calls, send or receive text messages, their location information will be recorded at the level of cell phone towers. And as many of you know, Shenzhen is a very special city. The city has going through rapid economic transformation in the last 20 to 30 years. It's also the first special economic zone in China. But when it becomes the special economic zone, only the 4 districts in the southern part are part of this special economic zone. And then later, the northern part, okay, the northern districts become part of it. In other words, over the years, there is imbalance in terms of the socioeconomic development in the city. So at the right side, you see we have some very nice places that are highly economically developed, and also we have places that are underdeveloped and sort of didn't catch up with the rapid urbanization and economic progression. So in this study, we just come up with one simple metric to quantify the size of people's activity space. If you observe people's cell phone data for a long period of time, you could, for example, estimate where people live and also where they practice their daily activities. So by measuring how people's activities deviate from where they live, so we come up with this simple equation to quantify the size of people's activity space, because the size is a very important indicator to review people's potential consumption of urban space. And then because we know where people live by associating users back to where they live, then we start to understand for different neighborhoods, how far, right, people travel every day. And then we find some interesting patterns. At the left side in this map, you show for those places that are highlighted in dark or shallow green. So more than 60 to 80% of the people who live here have a daily travel range smaller than 2 or even 1 kilometer. That means most of the people who live here have very confined activity territory. And we have overlaid the major factories in the city, because Shenzhen is a city with a lot of migrants and also migrant workers. So for example, we have the very famous industrial parks such as the Foxong parks over there. So you see there is a general agreement with these places with where the factory locates. And also if you look at the border between Futian and Luohu, so there are many places that are highlighted in green as well. So these corresponds to many urban villages the low income communities tend to occupy. And on the right side, you see a map that shows these places highlighted in blue. So people who live in these places generally have higher travel ranges than population average. So you can immediately see a very obvious north-south divide in the city that is in general agreement with the social economic divide in cities. And also we find there are many places, for example, people who live in this clustered purple areas, more than 60 to 80% of them have a daily activity range greater than 5 kilometers, basically very, very broad, very extensive activity spaces. Some of you might know that this area corresponds to the new Longhua district in Shenzhen. So the mission of the city is to build an area such that people who live in these areas could travel to any part of Shenzhen or let's say Hong Kong within even 30 minutes. And there are many intercity highways going through this area. And also we have the Shenzhen North Station in this area, so which is a very large transportation hub that provides transfer services among different modes. So in this study, we find some potential linkage between the way people use space and the socioeconomic development and also infrastructure development in the city. But for this particular paper, it is used CDR data, right? Some people might argue that, what if I don't use phone? So if people seldom, make phone calls, send text messages, the data will be very sparse. So whether the findings would be biased. So we want to see, for example, if we have a data with better temporal resolution, if we can track people regularly over time, well, that would be the same. Very fortunately, later we access to large scale data sets covering millions of phone users in Shenzhen. In these data sets, the users' locations are tracked regularly over time, once every hour, something like that. So no matter whether you make phone calls or not. So it's a special type of mobile signaling data. In Chinese, we call this 信令数据. By using a similar approach over these data sets with temporal resolution, we reproduce the results, which is very similar to the previous one that shows a north-south contrast. So people who live in these areas shown in dark blue or green, most of them have very confined activity territory. So it's sort of, to some extent, demonstrate the robustness of the findings. So this new paper was published 6 years ago in the Annals of AAG. After these two studies, we start to think about whether there is a universal relationship between human travel patterns or human mobility and their socioeconomic status. And it turns out that at the same time, there are many other studies that are doing similar things. They try to use mobile phone data to derive indicators and then to predict like poverty, wealth, unemployment rate, things like this. However, they are using different matrix, and also the findings tend to vary substantially. Therefore, in a new study, we try to derive a series of mobility indicators and then try to correlate that with people's socioeconomic status to see whether we could observe universal patterns among cities. And we access to large data sets in Singapore and Boston, so mobile phone data. But as I have said earlier, there is no semantic information about the socioeconomic status of users. That's why we have to incorporate a data fusion approach by including additional socioeconomic data sets, such as housing price data, or like in the US, we have census data that is publicly available that shows the spatial distribution of the household income. We try to link all these data together. So what we do is very simple. For each individual phone user, we try to estimate where that person lives, and then by associating that location to the socioeconomic data, basically housing price or income data, so we try to approximate the socioeconomic status of users. But note that this is not done at the individual level, but at a neighborhood or aggregate level. And at the meantime, we derive a series of indicators to quantify how people quantify individual users' mobility patterns. So this radius gyration quantifies the travel range, while we have other indicators that try to quantify the diversity of people's travel activities. So at the right side, there are two examples here. So for example, there are two persons. One, these locations shows the time or they spend at these locations, while the arc shows the travel frequency among different locations. So for this person X, most of his travels tend to distribute among a few locations. And for person Y, the travel patterns tend to be more diverse. And in that sense, person X has a lower activity entropy and travel diversity than person Y. Okay. And then we would associate these indicators to the estimated socioeconomic status and to see their relationship in the two cities. And first, we compare the relationship between the size of activity space, the travel range, with socioeconomic classes. So the higher the class here, the higher the socioeconomic class. So it turns out that in Singapore, the richer the people, the shorter they travel in the city. While we find an opposite trend in Boston. The richer the people, the farther, okay, the further they travel. So a very opposite trend. But if we look at, and we try to better understand this, we try to plot out the top neighborhoods, okay, by income in the city, top 20% of the neighborhoods. So if you know Singapore a little bit, so well, my cursor shows the city center, while you have more affluent urban amenities and the sufficient employment opportunities. So in Singapore, the rich neighborhoods tends to occupy the vicinity of the city center to get improved accessibility to these locations. Well, if you look at the top neighborhoods in Boston by income, so these or the housing price. So these places tend to be located, around the urban periphery rather than the downtown. So in a typical city like Boston, the rich people tend to occupy those places while they can seek better living conditions. So that's sort of one of the reasons that partially explain this relationship. And when we look at three other indicators, like a number of activity locations people travel in a general day, the diversity of daily activity and travel patterns, very surprisingly, in both cities, we see that this metric does not seem to vary significantly across user classes. So no matter whether you belong to the upper, middle, or lower social class, the level of activity diversity you exhibit tends to be very similar. And by looking at the distribution of these estimations, even we are using very different data sets, we are working on two different cities here. So their mean standard deviation, the distribution patterns are very similar. So which means these behavior dimensions, the activity diversity or regularity is deeply rooted in the way people practice daily activities. So later on, there are some other studies that try to do similar things, and they try to reflect their or compare their results with us. For example, recently there was a Nature Communication paper trying to look at mobility patterns in large US cities, and they say that they come up with a matrix to quantify the way people explore new places. So it's very equivalent to the diversity measures we have here. And they also quote our study saying that they found the results very consistent to our study that the place exploration or mobility diversity does not seem to vary significantly across different socioeconomic classes. In other words, this seems to be a very robust findings for many studies. And another study tried to analyze the phone data in another city in Colombia, and they tried to compare, for example, the activity range with socioeconomic classes, and they found that their findings is the same with that of Singapore, but of course, contrary to Boston. So in other words, we found that the relationship between the spatial size of activity space and the socioeconomic status tend to be more complicated. It tend to vary across cities. There are many factors that could affect it, such as the spatial urban structure, or how the housing neighborhoods and employment opportunities tend to locate in a city. So after this study, because the previous 3 ones deal with mobility and the socioeconomic status, and we try to further think whether we can combine these 2 dimensions together to do something more interesting. So we think about social segregation, because social segregation is interested in to understand how the people of different kinds they try to interact with the city within the city. So if we can use these data sets to better understand these aspects, it will be a good contribution. So this idea was initiated when I was a postdoctoral researcher at MIT Sensible City Lab, and later on it becomes a joint effort between the 2 sides. Traditionally, if you think about segregation, it's approached from the perspective of where people live, residential segregation. For instance, this is a very nice map shown by the New York Times that shows where people belonging to different races live in a city. So you clearly see there are some physical separations of different groups. So the residential segregation aims to quantify this physical separation, or say the uneven distribution of groups in the city. And then they usually come up with one single index to quantify the overall segregation of the city, whether people are more mixed or physically separated. They want to use this measure to indicate the potential interaction of people. But our question is that does residential segregation provides a very comprehensive view? Probably not, because there are some studies found a very interesting thing. Around 75% of the people we interact daily live more than 50 kilometers away. That means when we try to quantify the people's interaction in cities, we really need to take mobility into consideration. So in this study, we provide a very interesting computational framework, try to see how people belonging to different social classes interact with each other in the city. So there are 3 important components in our framework. First, we try to estimate each person's socioeconomic classes by either income or housing price, and then we try to rank them, try to assign unique rank to each of them. And then we have a matrix to quantify the social similarity between any 2 people. If 2 people are very similar, their similarity score is close to 1, and then if very different, close to 0. And fortunately, the data I'm going to introduce later on is a mobile big data. So in Singapore, the data not only records mobility, but also record people's communication patterns. So how their cell phone interactions. Therefore, by knowing that these social classes and also the communication strengths, we could quantify to what extent people would communicate with the similar others over the social network. And also the data set, documents mobility patterns. So we used a concept of co-location, basically try to estimate what kinds of people tend to appear at the same location at approximately the same time. So think about a city. If similar people tends to occupy the same places, that means the city is more segregated, right? People are just exposed to similar others. So we want to use this framework to do a very interesting thing. And different from traditional studies that look at overall segregation of the city, we could estimate the segregation for down to individual level. And due to time limitation, I'm not going to talk about the math behind it, but we try to apply this model using the data in Singapore covering 50 days. So the interaction strength for the social network is measured as the number of phone calls, text messages exchanged between two people. So to quantify the social segregation in the social network space, we try to come up with a so-called communication segregation index for each individual phone user. So that index ranges from 0 to 1. If a person has an index closer to 1, that means the person, most of his or her cell phone interactions are with people that are very similar to themselves in terms of social classes. And then by calculating this for each individual in the city, we come up with this distribution. You see, there are some people, basically, they are more socially exposed to similar people, while some people tend to interact with very different others. And a very unique feature for our index is that the baseline is 0.5. If one person tends to communicate with all other people in the city randomly, that index will be 0.5. So if you look at the overall distribution of the city, you see the mean value is about 0.55, means the overall segregation of the city is still more, let's say, more than this baseline value. People are still more socially exposed to similar others. And also at the right side, we do additional stuff. We try to correlate each individual's communication segregation index to the social class, right? To the social class they belong to. So the higher the social rank here, the more upper socioeconomic class they belong to. So we see that, you see there is a general upper trend. Means, the upper social class here, they have a higher value of communication segregation index, which indicates the rich club effect. So basically among the rich, the communication tends to distribute among themselves. And at the meantime, we try to come up with a physical segregation index for each person, okay? This is about how they share the physical urban space. Similarly, if a person receives an index close to 1, that means most of the time, he tends to share urban space with similar other people, okay? With others with similar social characteristics. So we could derive this distribution that shows the PSI for each individual person. You see, still higher than the baseline value, 0.5. So if we try to correlate with social rank, similarly, we got this rich club effect. That means that the richer people, they have their exclusive spaces in cities, which are not easily accessible, right, by others. So here, I want to note that the PSI index is trying to estimate people's exposure to others over the 24 hours of a day. We can also disaggregate this, okay, to each 1 hour time window to see how segregation changes over time. For example, here we use this average value, but we do this for individual hour, for instance. We will see, for example, on weekday and weekend, how the segregation changes over time. Because the lower the value, that means the higher level of the social integration. Basically, during the daytime, the level of social mixing in cities would be higher than nighttime. While the nighttime, this will be a very good indication of the level of residential segregation. So our framework is able to tackle the temporal part as well. And for these indices, we can also disaggregate at the level of places, try to find for each places its role of bringing, how they bring different types of people together. If some of you have ever been to Singapore, you probably know this as Sentosa Island. So this island is a very special place. First, it has many luxury properties, for the residents. And at the same time, it's a very popular attraction for leisure and tourism activities. So we try to come up with a place-based index to quantify the social roles of places. So the higher the indices means the higher the level of segregation. Basically, it's mainly occupied by very homogeneous population groups. So that's why you see both on weekdays and weekend, during the nighttime when people sleep, Sentosa Island has one of the highest segregation value. Basically, it's mainly occupied by the rich. But during the daytime, it has one of the lowest segregation value. Basically, it has a good capability of bringing different types of people together because people would come here, practice their activities, achieve an adequate level of social mixing. So this paper, if you're interested in that, it's published in the Journal of the Royal Society interface in 2019. And we also have a data visualization for that. So in this study, we have found this rich club effect, right? So rich people tend to communicate more with themselves. So this helps us to think what is the driving forces, because many people are in geography field. We know this distance decay effect. Is it because just rich neighborhoods are close to each other? For example, they are really close. They may have better opportunities to interact with each other. Is it just because they are clustered? So, for example, think about this scenario. In the city, we have two rich neighborhoods, we call class 5 neighborhoods, and also one poor neighborhood. If they are equally far away from each other, for example, two neighborhoods are just 2 kilometers from 2 kilometers away from each other. So we want to see whether they have similar communication frequency over their phones. Okay, so by doing this analysis, it turns out that when you control the distance, similar neighborhoods, they tend to have much higher communication intensity than dissimilar ones. So this sort of confirm a homophobic effect, which is a classic theory in social science. Basically, similar people, okay, tend to have higher interactions with each other. So very interesting finding. And then in this study, we also come up with a concept called homophobic distance. So what does it mean? Because if you think if similar neighborhoods, they have a higher communication intensity, even if they become far away and far away, their communication intensity would be still higher than, for example, the communication intensity between two completely different neighborhoods. So we want to see at which distance their communication frequency is still comparable to two different neighborhoods, even though they are close to each other. Even though we do this in Singapore, I want to borrow an example, a nice picture from the two neighborhoods in São Paulo, Brazil. For instance, you have a poor neighborhood, a rich neighborhood in a city. They are even very close to each other, but does it mean that they have very high level of communication, interaction patterns either over phones or in physical space? That might not be the case. So in the case of Singapore, we find that the homophobic distance between the very rich and poor neighborhood is about as you see here, 3.75 kilometers. What does that mean? That means in a city like Singapore, if two rich neighborhoods are even 3 or 4 kilometers away from each other, their communication frequency is as high as that one of the very rich and very poor community, even they are immediately close to each other. So in other words, a very important implication for this study is that if you just want to achieve social mixing by putting different types of neighborhoods together in the city is not enough per se. Co-presence does not mean enough interaction. So this paper was published in 2021 in the Annals of the AAG. So I have finished the first part. So the first part is about mobility, interaction, segregation for mainly urban residents. And now I'm going to switch my focus to the modeling of urban visitors, or say tourists. I came to PolyU about 4 years ago, and later I found that very fortunately the university has one of the best school of hotel and tourism management. And through interaction with them, I find that tourism studies is geospatial in nature. So we formed this very interesting collaboration that starts to look at how geospatial big data, geospatial technologies, and big data can be used to advance tourism mobility patterns. So for instance, if you know, for example, how travelers they move during their journeys, you could quantify a lot of things. For example, in this project, we analyzed a large scale mobile phone data set collected in South Korea. So the data set captures the travel patterns of international travelers to South Korea, the mobile phone data. So by tracking how they move between different cities, for instance, we could quantify how attractive the destination cities are to the visitors. So this is a very fundamental research topic in tourism. And we can also use network science approaches to understand which cities have very strong connections of tourism flows. And because hopefully you can see this GIF, okay? Because the data set also contains information about the nationality of travelers. So we could look at their spatial preferences. For example, very interestingly, if you look at the mainland Chinese people, their visits are mainly concentrated in Seoul area and Jeju. Well, look at Philippines. So their visits tends to along, mostly the coastal areas. And also we try to perform this so-called community detection algorithm to group cities into clusters, okay? Group city into clusters such that the cities within the same cluster, the same color here, they have strong connections in terms of tourism flows. In other words, the cities in the same cluster, they tend to be linked together in a traveler's travel itinerary, okay? So we do this analysis separately for different nationalities. We found interesting patterns. For instance, this is very small for mainland Chinese people's mobility network, but you can look at here. So basically this small dot refers to the Incheon, the largest international airport in Seoul, in South Korea. So it groups with the same community with the Seoul area. So which means that for mainland Chinese visitors, after they land to the Incheon International Airport, most of them, a lot of them would head directly to Seoul. While for people from United States, you see the airport is grouped with nearby cities, which means that a lot of them would first prefer to explore places that are nearby. So by using this kind of network science approaches, we can really see the mobility difference of people from the perspective of, locations, and also from the perspective of spatial interactions. So this paper was published not last year in a tourism journal. And also we have come up with prepared a big data visualization video. So I have listed the link here on both YouTube and Bilibili. So in the next study, we try to look at how tours use time. So some of you might know that time geography is a very important concept or subdiscipline in the geography domain. So when we have like high resolution mobile phone data, theoretically, we know, at every moment where each person is, and we can also infer what type of activity they are doing. So in that sense, we can quantify people's use of time. So in this study, we try to come up with a computational framework to achieve this purpose. For instance, think about a traveler who visited a city, stayed in a city for 5 days. By analyzing the person's cell phone trajectory, we could try to infer where the person live, for example, the accommodation or hotel place, where they practice their activities, shown in yellow here, and during which time they are just traveling between locations. And here the black segment represents the time while the person is heading to a city or has already left the city. By deriving this kind of semantics, we can generate a so-called time use diagram for traveler. For instance, for this traveler, he entered this city the first day in the late afternoon, checked into the hotel, spent the next day, 3 days in the city, didn't change the hotel location, practice activities during the day and have some travel patterns. And the last day, check out hotel, doing something, and then left the city. So, and we can also analyze the travel patterns for different types of travelers. For example, for this person, very differently, he didn't stay overnight, right? He come to the city in the early morning, visit a few places, and then left. So basically, we can automatically identify the time used for each traveler in any city we want. And then we can start to plot out these type of diagrams to look at the time use of travelers or tourists in a city. For instance, this is a city called Gangnam in South Korea. So in the day of May 15th, 2018, there are about 90 visitors who visit the city. So the horizontal axis shows the ID of individual tourists, and the vertical axis shows the 24 hours a day. And then you can really see different types of travelers, right? There are some people who stayed in the city for 24 hours of the day, and then some people doing something outside of the hotel. And these are the last day visitor, right? Check out of the hotel and then go to other cities. And these are pretty much first day visitors, right? Check into the hotel the first day and then maybe stay in the city for a few days. And these are what do we call the same day, okay, the same day visitors. We can do this for any city, right? For any city we want, and then we can understand their difference. For example, for this city, Chunchuan, you see more than 80% of the travelers are same day visitors, and they only stayed in the city for 1 or 2 hours. And we have just finished this year's winter Beijing Winter Olympic. So 4 years ago, the South Korea hosted this Pyeongchang Winter Olympic. And this city, Gangnam, is one of the cities that co-hosted some of the ice events. So we can also try to look at how people behave during these special events. For example, in this city of Gangnam, a few days before the ceremony, so the Winter Olympic has not started yet. So there are many people who stayed here overnight, maybe because the event has not started. Many people choose to leave here, right? They go to some other cities to have fun and then go back. And this is the last day of the Winter Olympic in the city, Gangnam. There are many ice events in the city. We observe the synchronized movements, okay? The blue bands means at those periods, like 8, 12, 16, many people start to move at the same time. So by checking, with the calendar, we find that, in between, so there are very important ice events in different sports arenas. So people after finish one activity, they go to another arena, so which shows this kind of synchronized movements. And this is the last day. So the first day after the closing of the Winter Olympics, so it's all already finished. You see, most of the people, they check out of the hotel and then leave the city. So we find this very interesting patterns that sort of demonstrate the robustness and meaningful patterns from the study. We not only quantify people's time use from the perspective of the city, but also at the individual level. We try to quantify how people spend time at different types of locations. For instance, in all these 3 cities, we quantify for people, if you come to the city, spend 24 hours, okay, 100% of time in the city. We find that for these people, on average, they spend 16 to 18 hours at the dwelling place, hotel accommodation place, 4 to 5 hours traveling or move around, very limited time, okay, at other locations. We have shared these insights with our collaborators in South Korea and tourism stakeholders, and they say that these numbers, 16 to 18 hours, are much higher, and the time spent on traveling or move around are much higher than they would expect. And they are thinking about whether they could have better strategies, like improving the transportation services or have smarter marketing strategies in order to persuade people to spend more time at other places. So this paper was published in 2021 in the Annals of AAG. So due to time limitation, I think for the next part, I'm just going to be very brief. I won't go into details. So for the next project, we are actually using AI and deep learning algorithms to understand how predictable the movements of tourists are. So this, understanding the predictability of travelers' movements is a very important topic that has great implications for, let's say, travel recommendation. So we try to analyze the data sets in the nationwide data sets in South Korea. So we try to identify the places people are interested in visit, and then we try to see how they move across these places, both within cities and across cities. And then we come up with 2 different algorithms. One is the very simple Markov chain method, and the other is a recurrent neural network model that can capture the more long-term dependency in people's travel patterns. And then we could evaluate the predictability of travelers' movements and which type of people are more predictable and the difference between the 2 models. So it turns out that the 2 models have very compatible performance for people who stay in the city for a short time, for example, less than 4 days. But if people stay in South Korea for really a long time, the RNN model it performs much better than the Markov chain model because it has the capability to capture the long-term dependency. And we also investigate, if you want to guess, when someone moves from one city to another city, so to what extent we can correctly guess that. So we have distinguished analysis for both intra-city and intercity movements. So if you're interested in that, the paper is published freshly this year in CEUS. And also we have a very nice data visualizations featuring the story. So it can be accessed on YouTube or Bilibili. Know that we are not only doing basic research for this, we are also doing technology transfer projects. We have deployed those machine learning and AI algorithms to provide a proof of concepts for travel recommendation system in Jeju. So it's a tourism city in South Korea. So we have deployed this as APIs. So if tourism stakeholders they want to use, it's possible. It's possible. So we could recommend locations to people and even recommend the popular activities and restaurants to them. All right, I'm sorry that I covered too much for today. So next, I'm going to spend another 2 or 3 minutes to talk about something in the post-pandemic, because these pretty much the thing that people are more interested in. So in terms of the impact of COVID on mobility, so there are many outstanding research in this area. I believe some people in the audience have done this as well. But a lot of research trying to look at how mobility changed under stringent interventions, basically what happened during the lockdowns. But now, we are maybe entering an endemic stage. So a very important question is how mobility change. So without very strong or stringent interventions. So it turns out that South Korea is a country that has never imposed any, intercity, travel restrictions. So this allows us to investigate how the pandemic, for example, impact the travel patterns. So in this pilot study, we'll still look at the case of Jeju here, is a tourism city. We want to see how COVID-19 impact the travel behavior of still visitors, tourists and travelers to the city. And as you see in 2020, the South Korea has experienced the 2 waves, national outbreak. So the number of daily cases are shown in red here. While Jeju, they also have sporadic cases over the time. So we want to quantify how these, for example, the pandemic spread both nationally and locally affect the travel patterns of people to the island. And we use this largest scale trip record data set collected from the largest mobile navigation app in South Korea. Because when people go to the place, they will start using this navigation service. So it's a very good indicative of private mode. So for information in Jeju, about 80 or 90% of the visitors, they would use a rental car or private vehicles. And in this study, we can investigate the changes of travel patterns over different courses of the pandemic. And because the data set also captures the trip purpose, the POI at the trip destination. So we can look at the overall reduction of trips to different types of places. And as you can see that, so the impact of the COVID did not diminish over time, but produced heterogeneous effects. For example, even after the second wave, the visits to cultural life facilities and markets remain to be very low. But the visits to restaurants, cafes, leisure sports have recovered to a greater extent. So the very last case study I'm going to introduce for today, still in Jeju Island, but we change the perspective to public transit. Because if you think about private mode and public transit, when you choose the second mode, you probably will be more conservative because it's more crowded, more people, a higher likelihood to be affected, at least from a psychological perspective. So we analyze a larger scale smart car data sets in the system, in the city. And then we also look at the number of ridership, how it changes over the 9 months in 2020. If you compare this reduction, the number with this, you will see that the public transit, the decay, is higher than that of the private mode. But there are 2 reasons for this. So first is that the number of users, if, for example, the pandemic is severe, fewer people would visit Jeju, and then this overall number of trips, number of ridership in the system would be lower. And another reason is that individual person might change the way they use the transit system. Let's say if you are a visitor, you visit Jeju before the pandemic. Every day when you take public transit, you can take 5 different trips. But after the pandemic, because I'm a little bit afraid, I might change the way I use the system. I only travel 1 or 2 trips in a day. So is that the case? So in our pilot study, we look at this perspective. So basically, for each traveler, so we try to derive a few indicators by quantifying the number of days you use the system, number of trips made per day, number of bus stations you use, and travel range. And then by combining pre-pandemic data and post-pandemic data, we use the time series decomposition to remove the residual and the seasonal patterns. We observe this trend. You see, very interestingly, in the first 6 to 7 months, of 2020, you see a decay of this trend, which means, for people who come to the city during the pandemic, they would use the public transit system in a more conservative way. So they still use it, but they use it for fewer days, make fewer trips, visit less stations, etc. So these are some of the things that we have found so far. And of course, we are also working on the impact of the COVID on behavior of urban residents. So hopefully we can share that, what we find in the near future. So that's all I want to talk about for the study cases. And I have 2 concluding slides to anticipate some of the things for human mobility analysis in the post-pandemic era. So this is a very big field. There are many experts here and around the world. So I have no way to anticipate from an overall perspective, just to share some of my personal view. First, I think, in the pandemic, we will really treat mobility as a function of time and environmental disruptions, try to look at how mobility change over a very long period of time. So I think in the future, at least the near future, so longitudinal aspects, so long-term urban analytics, I think will be motivated and rewarded to see how cities and mobility adapt to different kinds of things over a long period of time. But of course, the challenges would be the accumulation of the data sets. So very different to other data sets like remote satellite images. So like mobile data and other smart card data, you're very hard to gather it for multiple years. So these would be challenges down the road. And I also find there are some studies trying to not analyze mobility per se, but use mobility as a reference. For example, there's a recent Nature Communication paper. They try to look at in cities when there is a dramatic decrease of mobility, how does it change other behavior dimensions? When you cannot go out, for instance, how does it change the way you purchase goods? How does it the way change you eat, your dietary interest? So we would treat mobility as a reference. And of course, mobility will be used as, I would say, a social lens to investigate many fundamental issues in a modern society, such as segregation, economic inequality, or what we call tourist-host interaction, like over-tourism impact in cities, and there are other things. So I think these topics will remain very, very essential and important in the future. So I think I finished my talk for today. A lot of these things are achieved through the collaborations with other university research institute, and many of the implementations are done by our own research students and assistants. So the credits belong to all of them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Xu. And I think this is a fantastic talk. And so we have learned a lot. And now the floor is open and we can have some questions. I just checked the chatting box and there are already some questions. And Dr. Xu, can you open your chat box? And there are already some questions there.
Yes, so which one I should start looking at? I think
you can take the audience. If anyone wants to ask, they can unmute them. I think I asked a couple questions in the chat box, but it's the low priority, so you don't need to answer them right now. Just let the audience go first.
Okay. Yes, so we can just first leave the room for our audience. And so if you have questions, please hand up.
I think there are some questions. How could researchers gain access to those CDR datasets? So this is a good question. I think for those who can access this, they're blessed. They are fortunate to get them. So for us, we got some of these datasets through the interactions, through the research collaborations or some national level research projects. And we have signed, for example, NDI, non-disclosure agreement, and also the datasets are anonymized. And these days, there are also open datasets. For example, in the United States, you will see the SafeGraph datasets that they have released, that they're the national level mobile phone data, but in an aggregate format for 1 or 2 years. So there are ways to access this data in an open way. There are public datasets out there.
Can you talk a little bit more about the attributes contained in the data besides the location? What kind of information are in the data?
So in general, the mobile phone data, they are not rich in terms of the attribute information. So you only know, for example, the XY coordinates of the cell phone station, the time step, and randomly generated ID, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, that can uniquely identify the users, but you don't know what that person is. So other than that, usually you don't have other information. You don't know the age, you don't know the socioeconomic classes, you don't know other user profiles. So that's why usually you have to link it with socioeconomic data sets to do more meaningful stuff. Yeah.
Did they intentionally, for the location, for the coordinates, is it accurate, or is they intentionally add some something today to make it less accurate?
It's not. They didn't intentionally change it, but still, you think about the way the positioning of cell phone data. So whenever you use the phones, it would connect to one of the nearest cell phone tower. Okay. So one cell phone tower would have a very large service radius, but all the cell phone towers would be located, using the XY coordinates of the tower, the device. So in other words, so many people might share the same XY coordinates, but they are at different places. So that's what I say that is the location or the positional uncertainty of the data. So in highly dense urban areas, this accuracy could be a few hundred meters. But in less populated areas, a cell tower could cover, a few kilometers in radius, therefore making the positional accuracy less reliable.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have some questions from our audience, and I'm not sure Dr. Chen here. So.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Xu. Really appreciate your presentation. So I just wonder, one, you may heard about article published on Nature from Lei Dong. He also used mobility data to extract the human mobility pattern. So I just wonder the issue, in China, especially in mainland China, it's very hard for you to get the mobility from the individual mobility data because of some privacy issue. So I heard you use a lot of data in the South Korea or in the United States. So did you encounter the similar difficulties, and will they allow you to use the individual level data instead of the aggregated level data, because it totally impacts how you analyze your results? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. First, I think I'm not sure whether Lei Dong is here, so he should treat you for dinner because he tried to mention his Nature paper. First of all, for some of our study, as I've said, we have obtained the success through some research collaborations or by doing some technology transfer projects, and then we receive the permission for using them for research purpose. And you see that, as I've mentioned, the example of safe graph data, for example, is in aggregate format. Basically, you have less privacy concerns, but in terms of the value of the data, so if you compare individual level data and the aggregate level data, the thing they're able to do is very different. You think about aggregate data, you try to model spatial interactions, try to do, for example, gravity model stuff, try to simulate epidemic spread. But the individual level data could tell you more about, the heterogeneity for people, and also try to link it with some other dimensions, such as, socioeconomic inequality, things like that. So I think there is a trade-off. There is a trade-off, but we do see that in the trend, especially in China and also in European countries, it is more difficult. It is more difficult to get individual level data. So for us, we cannot assume that this data will be readily available for us in the future. We still have to get prepared. Even if we don't have individual level, we only have aggregate level, or even no access, for example, to mobile phone data. How should we continue this line of research? This is also something that we have to think about. Hopefully, I answer your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Ms. Yuan Yihong.
Thank you, Yang. Hi. Yeah, really fascinating presentation. So I have a specific question about your methodology. It's for the first project you discussed regarding the modeling of activity space based on mobile phone data. You talked about different types of indicators to model activity spaces. And I remember you mentioned both activity entropy and also travel diversity. Can you explain a little bit more about the difference between the two? Because it seems to me that both indicators are about regularity of movements. And can you explain a little bit more about how you calculate the travel diversity?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I'm sorry, due to time limitation, I don't explain them in detail. So basically, these two are both entropy-based measures. Well, for activity entropy, basically, for each person, he might visit a set of places, and then we quantify the percentage of time or percentage of visit at each location. And then we would use as the input to quantify entropy. Basically, if your activity tends to distribute among many different active locations, you have a higher entropy. While for travel diversity, we use basically each entity would be an OD pair. So you measure the percentage of travels among an OD pair, use that as the percentage of input to calculate the entropy as well. But usually these two dimensions are correlated, right? If you have many different, active locations, then the travel diversity tends to increase in general.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And we have another question. Mike Gangchen.
Hi, Dr. Yang.
Hey, hello, Christian.
I do have a question about like the mobility prediction part. So since your study time range is in 2018, so probably it's like a pre-pandemic, but you also discuss how humans mobility change in the pre-pandemic and after the pandemic. Based on my experience, when you do a time series forecasting, especially for time human mobility and so on and so forth, they are very difficult to handle. For example, extreme event when you see, okay, there is a pandemic outbreak, then this time series data is very poor to predict whether this decrease of mobility or increase of mobility. I wonder, do you have any, like when you connected these two research, this question come into my mind. I wonder whether you have some interesting observation based on your experiment.
Thanks for this question. So let me try to clarify first. Are you talking about these studies to try to predict individual mobility, or about this predict aggregate travel patterns in the post-pandemic?
It's more about the second one, yeah. But
this one.
Yeah. So say if you want to train an RNN model, or if you want to train a Markov chain model, as you said, but based on my understanding, when I want to using this kind of time series forecasting model, it's very difficult to capture this kind of extreme event. Say, when you have a disease outbreak, then people's mobility will decrease dramatically. And this time series forecasting cannot capture that.
You are definitely right. From this perspective, I don't think there is a perfect way. Or, if you don't know what will happen in the future, definitely you cannot well predict that, right? But we definitely can learn from this pandemic so that we can get prepared for the next one. So as far as I know, I think because you are an expert in this area of machine learning and deep learning, I have done very limited stuff, but I have checked some papers. So very few papers now trying to use, for example, RNN or deep learning models trying to predict that. So they try to use, for example, regression models, right? Trying to explain the things. And for example, for some of the studies, they will use this discontinuity regression design. Basically, in Chinese, we call that what? 断点回归 something. But basically, there are some key points that you find, a mobility shock. Well, the whole thing basically changed. If you just want to use one RNN model to capture that, basically is maybe not feasible, because there are two different principles between that time point and after that. So maybe a very interesting question would be how you would incorporate this mobility shock or some key reference points into the model design. So if that can be considered and then be integrated as a holistic deep learning model, that would be a very interesting question from both the technical and also the empirical perspective.
Nice. Thank you for the remark.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And any other questions? And Dr. Wu, you still have question?
Yeah, Dr. Gao can go first.
Okay, yeah, thank you. First of all, yeah, thank you, Dr. Yang, and for your excellent presentation as always. So actually, Yihong's question also reminds me, I think the study about regularity versus diversity, specifically by entropy, because in the case, for example, in some other extreme cases, for example, one person visited 3 unique locations, and then like A, B, C, but maybe stay in A for maybe certain hour and B the same, but in another case, he or she may actually stay for the still uniquely visit the 3 same locations, but the sequence could be like ABC, maybe CBA. Right. So there, if we compute the entropy, it actually will be the same by hourly basis. But considering the actual sequence regarding the regularity, there might be, differences. So this is why, inspired by Yihong's question, I think there exists some other alternative measures to measure the regularity, diversity. I feel that's actually very important to see. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments. I agree with you. So the way we deal with this matrix are still at a very rudimentary level. So we haven't gone very deep into that. So the reason we come up with this very simple matrix is because many studies trying to use these very simple indicators. They derive tons of them and then put them into, for example, random forest model, and then trying to predict people's social classes. And then we don't want to approach a machine learning approach. We just try to correlate them to see whether the relationship would be different in cities. Basically, implication of the study is that it's not easy, for example, to deploy a universal model in different cities that by simply calculating indicators, you can guess people's socioeconomic class. But in terms of what you say about the regularity diversity, itself is a very big field. So there are many intriguing questions. So and also given the many limitations of the phone data in terms of the temporal sparsity, location uncertainty, I think we really need to be careful in the way we quantify them. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and next, I think Dr. Wu still have questions.
Yeah, one last question. So I think your presentation is eye-opening. It's a fantastic presentation, and particularly, I really like your visualizations. Can you share, for example, what kind of tools or packages you use to create these kind of visualizations?
Thank you very much. First, I must confess that the visualization, most of the implementation are done by our excellent students. I'm just the designer, trying to push this forward. So basically, we are in both this urban tool and also the urban network data visualization. We are just using. We are just using the should be DAC.gl. So it's a library, developed by Uber. I believe. So we try to feed the data into the framework because it can both tackle, you see, the 2D data visualization and 3D. Sometimes we need to use 3D as well. So we feel that this is a very good tool for us. And we also teach students to do that because they have another version called Kepler.gl, right? You can simply load CSV data into it and start to do the visualization. But our data visualization is more, I would say, more complicated. So we have to use the developed version. So basically DAC.gl, and some of the data pre-processing are done in Python.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know those two packages. They can both do a lot of very fancy 3D mapping. I think what's they call Unfolded Studio. They kind of
yeah.
Those people from Kepler.gl, they kind of develop a new company, and
that's right.
They purchased by Foursquare or something. So they have a new kind of products coming out of Kepler.gl. So it's quite fancy. So I just need to try it out. But thank you for sharing.
That's right. I do see that they posted this tweet. So it's like the new product is not completely different from the Kepler or DAC.
Yeah, it's kind of built on top of that, but I think it's that they have a lot more capability. So now it looks like Kepler.gl is not very much actively maintained. They kind of move away the priority to the new company. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Because you are the expert in this field, so I think in the future.
Not really. I'm more like in 2D, so in 3D, I'm still have a lot to
yeah, we may switch it from the to the unfolded or something in the future. Yeah, depending on how powerful they are. Thanks for the comments.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have just over like 10 minutes. I think maybe we can if our audience still have questions, you can hands up. If no, I think we can leave these questions after our session. So no questions from audience.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I need to close this session because we have over like 10 minutes. So if you still have questions, please contact Dr. Yang Xu, and so we will. I'm sure we will have another very hot discussions and through mails, and also we have another chances in our future coming like workshops and also like sessions. Yeah. So thanks Dr. Xu, and thanks all of you to and also thanks all of you to join us today. So I think next talk will be
in 2 weeks. Yeah, we send out the announcement, and this presentation is also being recorded, so we post the video later today, so you can follow the CPGIS WeChat group and or YouTube, and so there'll be a lot to digest. So I think you can watch a couple of times to learn a little bit more about Dr. Xu's work. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. And also, I would like to add one sentence, and also welcome you to join us and our Annals of GIS best paper and most cited paper sessions in the 3rd day of April. So I will just post our links and also our information through WeChat account. So welcome all of you to join us. Yeah. See you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.